Hello there and welcome to the Week in Parliament. Coming up on this programme, as winter tightens its grip, there's a row in the Commons about the health of the health service.
Our NHS, Mr Speaker, is in crisis, but the Prime Minister is in denial.
The only way that we can ensure we've got funding for the National Health Service is a strong economy.
With the Stormont Assembly in crisis, we find out what's gone wrong in Northern Ireland's power sharing agreement. Also on this programme, a damning indictment of the UK's approach to defence.
We're short-sighted, penny-pinching, naively optimistic. We're complacent and we're ostrich-like to the way in which the world has become interconnected.
And how can we get more women into Parliament? A senior MP thinks it's time for action.
In our committee sessions, we heard very warm words from all of the party chair and leaders. We didn't really hear very much detail.
But first, it was a parliamentary week dominated by the stresses and strains facing England's NHS. MPs returned to Westminster after the Christmas break to news that the National Health Service had been at full stretch over the holidays. The Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt told the Commons that it had been a tough Christmas and that, with cold weather on the way, the winter pressures were likely to continue.
The Tuesday after Christmas was the busiest day in the history of the NHS, and some hospitals are reporting that A&E attendances are up to 30% higher compared to last year.
And he looked to the future.
It is clear we need to have an honest discussion with the public about the purpose of A&E departments. There is nowhere outside the UK that commits to all patients that we will sort out any health need within 4 hours. Since it was announced in 2000, there are nearly 9 million more visits to our A&Es, up to 30% of whom NHS England estimate do not need to be there, and the tide is continuing to rise. So if we are going to protect our 4-hour standard, we need to be clear it is a promise to sort out all urgent health problems within 4 hours, but not all health problems, however minor.
Labour said the NHS was in a worse state than the Health Secretary had suggested.
15 hospitals ran out of beds in one day in December. Several hospitals have warned they can't offer comprehensive care. Elderly patients have been left languishing on hospital trolleys in corridors, sometimes for over 24 hours. And he says care is only falling over in a couple of places. I know La La Land did well at the Golden Globes last night. I didn't realise the Secretary of State was living there. Perhaps that's where he's been all weekend.
He seems to be blaming the public for overwhelming A&E departments, when he well knows the reason the public go to A&E is because they can't get to see their GP, and social care is in crisis.
So it was no surprise that the Labour leader raised the NHS at Prime Minister's questions a couple of days later.
Earlier this week, the Prime Minister said she wanted to create a shared society. Well, we've certainly got that. More people sharing hospital corridors on trolleys. More people sharing waiting areas at A&E departments. More people sharing in anxiety created by this government. Our NHS, Mr Speaker, is in crisis, but the Prime Minister is in denial. Can I suggest to her, on the economic question, cancel the corporate tax cuts. Spend the money where it's needed on people in desperate need in social care or in our hospitals.
He talks to me about corporation tax and restoring the cuts in corporation tax. The Labour Party has already spent that money 8 times. The last thing the NHS needs is a cheque from Labour that bounces. The only way that we can ensure we've got funding for the National Health Service is a strong economy. Yesterday, the Right Honourable Gentleman proved that he's not only incompetent, but that he would destroy our economy, and that would devastate our National Health Service.
But does the NHS have the money that it needs? The head of the NHS in England told MPs that spending per person in real terms was set to reduce.
I think it would be stretching it to say that the NHS has got more than it has asked for.
OK, and so would you agree with Mr Hobson there's not enough money, that there's a clear gap?
There are clearly very substantial pressures, and I don't think it helps anybody to try and pretend that there aren't. But that's not a new phenomenon to some extent. It's a phenomenon that is intensifying. I think this debate about, 2020 this, 2020 that, kind of misses the point, actually, which is that in the here and now, there are very real pressures. Over the next 3 years, funding is going to be highly constrained. And in 2018-19, as I previously said in October, real terms, NHS spending per person in England is going to go down 10 years after Lehman Brothers and austerity began. We all understand why that is, but let's not pretend that that's not placing huge pressure on the service.
Sir Simon Stevens. Now, a political crisis is threatening the future of the power-sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland. On Monday night, Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness resigned as Deputy First Minister and, in effect, brought down the devolved administration at Stormont. But what's going on, and how did we get here? Chris Page explains.
This row between the power-sharing partners at Stormont has ostensibly been triggered because of the financial mismanagement of a green energy scheme. The renewable heat incentive was set up in 2012 and overseen by DUP ministers. It was supposed to encourage businesses to switch to environmentally friendly fuels, but subsidies were too generous and initially there was no upper limit on payments, so the scheme ran massively over budget. At the moment, the overspend is expected to run to almost £500 million. The Deputy First Minister, Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness, asked the DUP leader Arlene Foster to stand aside as First Minister for an investigation, but Mrs Foster refused to do so, so Mr McGuinness has now resigned himself. That automatically puts Mrs Foster out of a job, because under the power-sharing system, the First and Deputy First Ministers can't work in isolation. There are many other disagreements between the parties on issues like Brexit, same-sex marriage and budgets. It's never been an easy relationship between the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin. Under the Stormont rules, if the posts of First and Deputy First Minister aren't filled within 7 days, then the Northern Ireland Secretary James Brokenshire must, by law, call a new election to the Stormont Assembly, and it's just 8 months since the last one.
The crisis was raised at Prime Minister's questions by the SNP's Westminster leader, who thought the breakdown could have wide-reaching implications.
The Prime Minister has indicated that she wants to take the views of the elected representatives and the devolved institutions on Brexit seriously. So it stands to reason then that if there is no Northern Irish Assembly and there is no Northern Irish Executive for much of the time before the March timetable that she has set before invoking Article 50, that she'll be unable to properly consult, to fully discuss and to find agreement on the complex issues during this time period. In these circumstances, will the Prime Minister postpone invoking Article 50?
Of course. Northern Ireland.
Will she postpone Article 50, or will she just plough on regardless?
I'm clear that, first of all, we want to try to ensure that within this period of 7 days we can find a resolution to the political situation in Northern Ireland so that we can continue to see the Assembly government continuing. But I'm also clear that in the discussions that we have, it will be possible. I mean, it is still the case that actually ministers are in place and that obviously there are executives in place, that we are still able to take the views of the Northern Ireland people.
Theresa May. Now let's take a step back in time. Do you remember this? When Tony Blair swept to power in 1997, there was much fanfare about the number of women who'd become MPs. Nicknamed the Blair Babes, they represented a big jump in the numbers, in large part due to Labour's policy of all-women shortlists. In total, 101 Labour women were elected in 1997, doubling the overall total of female MPs from 60 to 120. Well, spin forward 20 years and there are now 195 women MPs, but that's still only 30%. The Women and Equalities Committee has been looking at how to boost those numbers. It's suggested that in future, political parties should be fined if they don't ensure that at least 45% of general election candidates are female. I asked the committee chair, Maria Miller, if a system of fines wouldn't have a disproportionate impact on smaller parties.
Well, clearly you'd have to look at how smaller parties were dealt with, but the lion's share of MPs are from the main parties who contest all of the Westminster seats, and we feel very strongly if you're going to put a measure like a 45% quota on candidates in place, there need to be teeth there to make that really have an effect.
In the end, doesn't this all come down to the local associations, that you can say to the parties, this is what we want? But if you have local associations which, I don't know, maybe have slightly older members, slightly old-fashioned views, they might just still cling on to this idea that they'd prefer to have a man doing the job, and that's what you've got to overcome.
But at the 2015 general election, only 1 in 4 candidates was female. So we're not really giving people the chance to be able to choose women locally. Local associations may not be given enough choice from female candidates in the first place. So I think we've really got to look back at the root cause of this, which is getting more women to consider putting themselves forward to become a Member of Parliament. A lot of that is about outreach by Parliament to get people to consider that, but also by the parties as well.
What is it that puts women off putting themselves forward?
I think we've in the past focused a great deal on things like childcare and family-friendly working, and the work that Sarah Childs has done is important in that area. But I think there's more than that that's really emerging now, and I think the dissuading effect of online abuse, sexual harassment, but also the murder of Joe Cox last year, I think really shows that those sorts of intimidatory aspects are also need to be dealt with, and the Parliament is dealing with that at the moment.
But surely those would be things that would put off men as well as women.
But I think all of the research would suggest that women are disproportionately affected by particularly online abuse, and applaud the work the police are doing in securing convictions there. But it is an element that I think some women are finding off-putting. We need to tackle that, but we also need to have more effective outreach to get more women to consider how important it would be to be able to represent the community, but also improve the community in which they live.
Now, you said that it's not for you, it's not for your committee to tell parties exactly how to go about this, but isn't the long and the short of it that all women shortlists have worked and that the Labour Party has increased more dramatically and more quickly its number of women MPs?
Just in the same way as having a female MP, Prime Minister isn't the panacea for all evils, neither is all women shortlists. I think different political parties have done different things in the past. I think that parties need to have a plan, and they need to have a plan which is effective. And whilst in our committee sessions we heard very warm words from all of the party chair and leaders, we didn't really hear very much detail. So I think the most important thing is that those parties have a clear plan and a real will to make this change.
How confident are you that things will be different this time round, that going into the next election there will be more female candidates in winnable seats?
I think that will only happen if the parties now take a hard look at the processes they're following and make sure that they've got clear plans in place to put women in those winnable seats. And at the moment we're not seeing those plans coming through. And if we don't have plans in place, there will be no change in the status quo. It's highly likely at the next election, with a reduction in the number of constituencies, that there will be fewer opportunities for women to come through, or for new members of Parliament to come through. So those parties need to have a clear plan, and at the moment that's not there.
So it doesn't sound to me like you're terribly optimistic.
Only if we see, I think, a radical change in the not just the warm words that we're hearing from parties, but actually the practical measures they're putting in place, the funding that they're putting in place, will we see that change. Perhaps there's too many other things to think about at the moment. We've got a little bit of time before the next election, I hope, a little bit of time for real action.
All right, well, we'll get you back to see how it's going. Maria Miller, thank you very much indeed for coming into the programme. Thank you. Maria Miller. Now let's take a look at some of the other news from around Westminster in brief. There was a big surprise in Westminster on Friday morning with the announcement that the Labour MP, Tristram Hunt, is to stand down to become the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. His decision will trigger a by-election in the Stoke-on-Trent Central constituency. In a letter to local party members, the former education spokesman, who resigned from the shadow cabinet when Jeremy Corbyn was elected party leader, said serving in Parliament had been both deeply rewarding and intensely frustrating. Financial jobs in London are bound to be affected by Brexit, but a lack of knowledge about the government's plans will make the situation worse. That was the message to the Commons Treasury Committee from leading financiers, including the head of the London Stock Exchange. They called for the city to have its own transitional arrangements known as grandfathering, meaning new rules wouldn't apply for around 5 years.
Part of the uncertainty and the planning, if you like, is how much would you have to move? Clearly you would need to move the front part of the business, the relationship managers that talk to customers, because that is the line. But the question would be whether the negotiation would allow the middle and back office, the settlement, the risk management, the accounting and so on, to be done outside of EU27, or whether EU27 as part of the negotiation say, no, if we're going to give you a licence, we want everything in our country. Now, that's a political negotiation as much as a technical negotiation.
Immigrants have to make more effort to fit in. That's according to the author of last month's Casey Review on integration. Dame Louise Casey told MPs that Britain needed to be less shy about telling immigrants what was expected from them. She was asked how she defined integration.
No, I don't think it's a two-way street. I think that's a soundbite that people like to say, which is integration is a two-way street. I would say, if we stick with the road analogy, that I think integration is more like you've got a bloody big motorway and you have a slip road of people coming in from the outside, and what you need to do is people in the middle in the motorway need to accommodate and be gentle and kind to people coming in from the outside lane, but we're all in the same direction and we're all heading the same direction. I think it gets into this place where we have this idea that it's a two-way street. To some degree it's a two-way street, but to some degree it is not. There is more give on one side and more take on the other, and I think that's where we have successively made a mistake, which is we've not been honest about that.
The government was defeated in the Lords on Monday over plans to change the way England's universities are run. The legislation is designed to make it easier for new colleges to award degrees. Peers voted in favour of an opposition amendment to the Higher Education Bill to define the powers and aims of universities.
This is the first major bill on higher education for a generation. It's going to have far-reaching consequences. One of its aims, as we've heard, is to extend university title considerably. It's a matter of great concern to me that this piece of legislation has so far made no attempt to define what a university is, or its role in society and more widely, and particularly what do we expect these new universities to do.
The government spokesman said there were dangers in setting out a definition of a university that could be challenged in the courts.
A university has never been defined in legislation before, and we are not aware of this in itself that has led to particular problems in the system.
Labour says plans to close dozens of local tax offices should be immediately scrapped after a spending watchdog found costs have spiralled. The National Audit Office revealed HMRC has had to rethink the proposals after underestimating the expense and the scale of disruption involved.
The NAO reports confirmed our fears. First of all, it calls the original office closure plan unrealistic. The estimates of the costs of the move increased by 22%, £600 million extra. It forecasts a further 5,000 job losses. It finds that the costs of redundancy and travel have tripled from 17 million to 54 million. And it says HMRC can't demonstrate how its services can be improved. And it hasn't even produced a clear programme business case for the planned closures. As we predicted, this is an emerging disaster.
Given how clear and stark the warnings actually are, would it not simply make more sense to pause this, rip it up and start again?
For the public, what this really means is a better, more modern service, run by fewer staff, costing around £80 million a year less by the time these changes take effect. It's a plan to say goodbye to the days of manual processing of tasks that can be done more easily with today's technology.
The UK's Green Investment Bank could be killed off if the government goes ahead with plans to sell it, according to one MP. The bank supports offshore wind farms and other green projects. The government has announced plans to part privatise it, with Australian bank Macquarie thought to be the preferred bidder.
Founded in 2012, the GIB has been widely recognised as a true success story, kick-starting truly innovative low-carbon projects across the UK. And yet, this preferred bidder, Macquarie, not only has a dismal and terrible environmental record, it also has an appalling track record of asset stripping.
The minister said he couldn't comment on the process, potential bidders or media speculation.
It's precisely because we want the Green Investment Bank to be able to do more unfettered from the constraints of the state that we are seeking to put it into the private sector. And the objectives that we have set out in the sale could not have been clearer. They've been discussed in this House, but we have also been very clear that the reason we want to move it into the private sector is to enable the business to grow and continue as an institution supporting investment in the green economy.
A former NATO Secretary-General has warned against further defence cuts, saying the UK is sleepwalking into potential calamity. Opening a debate on the UK's armed forces capability, the Labour former Defence Secretary Lord Robertson also questioned US President-elect Donald Trump's attitude to NATO. During the US election campaign, Donald Trump appeared to play down the importance of the military alliance, which raised questions about NATO's commitment, known as Article 5, which says members will support NATO countries if they're attacked. In his speech in the Lords, Lord Robertson warned the world was now seeing a bonfire of the post-Cold War certainties. He told peers he'd recently been asked what was the biggest threat to the safety and security of the UK, and the list of potential answers was a long one.
I consider some of the immediate and looming challenges and threats that there are, and some of them are pretty formidable. Migration flows, which have suddenly ended up on our shores, the spread of religious extremism and jihadi violence plumbing new depths of savagery, a restive and resurgent Russia, a rising China, and the disruption of North Korea. But my answer to the question of what was the greatest threat is actually different. It is ourselves. We are our own worst enemies. We're short-sighted, penny-pinching, naively optimistic. We're complacent, and we're ostrich-like to the way in which the world has become interconnected, more fragile, more unpredictable, and more incendiary.
He moved on to the election of Donald Trump as US President.
The Donald, with his Mexican wall, with new protectionism and isolationism, with his serious questioning of NATO solidarity, with a belief in torture, and with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn as his key security advisors. Perhaps we don't actually need more enemies in the world today.
A former Conservative Defence Secretary was one of many to raise fears about Russia.
I hope sincerely that President Putin and his colleagues realise how easily that mobilisations and provocations, that accidents can happen, and how easily conflict can start. And we don't have to have the memories of the First World War and our memories of the Second World War, where wars started by accident involving the wrong people, the wrong time, which weren't meant to happen. And I just do take that factor very seriously, and I hope they're aware of it.
In the face of Russian ambition, my lords, Europeans can no longer get their defence on the cheap. And it's an interesting reflection that whereas the word burden sharing used to be used when one went to Washington, now the assessment of Europe's contribution is, shall we say, expressed in more trenchant and perhaps less suitable terms for a debate of this kind.
We lack strength in numbers. We are not well placed to deal with the inevitable unseen, least of all against a capable foe. The more independently minded we become, the more capability we need in a dangerous world. Surely the two must go together.
Defence spending is going up. When defence spending will increase by $5 billion over the